Okay, good evening to everyone. Welcome to our webinar, which is organized by the Department of Political Science and IR of Bahçeşehir University. We will discuss about the prospective effects of the coronavirus pandemic over the political landscape in the economically advanced countries, and particularly we will try to focus on the debates regarding populism, the rise of the populist politics. How can the corona pandemic affect the future of the populist politics, and what could be the consequences over the voting behaviors of the masses, especially in the upcoming elections? There are many elections that will be held later this year, and the most popular one is the one that will be held in the United States, the presidential elections in November. But there are also plenty of other examples. So the social and political divides, which are fostered by the populist politics, have particular outlooks, especially during the coronavirus pandemic era. The social divides can be said to be even get deeper during the pandemic era. There are some rallies that were organized in the United States against the lockdown measures that were initiated by a number of state governors, and President Trump was behind all these rallies. So there are actually many topics that are linked, that are related to the political outcomes of the coronavirus outbreak. Today we will discuss these vital issues with two distinguished academics. Emre Erdoğan from Istanbul Bilgi University. He is known for his researches, mostly quantitative researches regarding the political topography and the social basis, the social divides that shape politics. So we know that he has plenty of things to say about the populist politics in the era of coronavirus pandemic. Our second distinguished guest is Yunus Sözen from Lemoyne College, United States. So he is also an expert on contemporary political movements, particularly populism. He has many things to say about these issues. So during the debate, we can also perhaps address to the political issues in Turkey, but our main focus will be on the economically advanced Western countries. Before letting the floor to our distinguished guests, I would like to remind you something about the questions. So for not interrupting the natural course of the debate, I will ask you to write your questions on the chat board. So those who have any questions or comments, please feel free to write them down on the chat board. So when the first part of today's webinar will end, I mean the presentations of Professor Erdoğan and Professor Sözen will come to an end, then another part will begin that will be a Q&A session, and in that session we will deal with your questions, and we will also discuss your comments if there are any. So if our guests are ready, I would like to begin with Professor Emre Erdoğan. Emre, thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here with you. The floor is yours. The length of your presentation can be around 20 minutes, but if you exceed that time frame, it's not a big deal. Actually, you can feel free to just a bit extend the time frame if you really need to do that. Okay, so Emre Erdoğan will present his he will deliver his presentation entitled "Think Emotionally, Act Rationally, anger and voting behavior.
Thank you. It's a nice opportunity for me to be here and present my ideas. And as you can see, I will try to convince you that thinking is something emotional, but we can still behave in a rational way. I hope you can see my presentation. The generation of my generation, famous generation, X, very well knows this person. This is Mr. Spark. And his most important characteristic is rationality. He doesn't have any emotion. That's why he was acting as the voice of the reason, and he was developing very nice alternatives and opportunities, etc. But within time, we learned that we need emotions for thinking. Without emotions, it is not possible to think, but I don't want to make a lecture about the recent findings of neuroscience. Instead, I will try to show that emotions, they are very important part of our political life. The Enlightenment presented politics as something rational, in a rationality domain. But recent studies, which is called as the affective turn, show that emotions or the affect plays a very important role. And in my presentation, I will focus on the US, the recent developments in the US, and in a very specific character of a very famous movie, Inside Out, The Anger. If you had a chance to watch this movie by Pixar, it's very nice and it's very scientific indeed. Anger is one of the most striking characters in this movie. But before moving to anger, I would like to focus on the concept of grievances. And they are very well known in the literature of political participation, especially as a result of political movements of 1970s and 80s, especially the work of Idari presents a very important perspective to understand why people are participating to that kind of violent or non-violent protest because of deprivation. We are deprived. The first definition and first dimension of deprivation is material, which is defined as when people are unable to obtain some goods such as food, shelter, etc., or education. It may depend on the context, and it is possible to measure this dimension physically. Income, etc., etc. It is possible to ask questions and collect this data. But there is another dimension of deprivation, which is relative deprivation. We are comparing ourselves with other people. It's something psychological, and that's why it's not easy to measure objectively. It's psychological. It is based on perceptions. It is not, of course, it's correlated with your objective stand, but it is also related with your perception, and it is highly related with your reference group. It's something dynamic. First, psychological. Secondly, subjective. Third, dynamic. And in this definition, as Gar said, it's an egoistic relative deprivation. It is based on the situation of mind. But we then learned that it is something group-based. I can have a good life. I can have access to all my needs. And when I compare myself with my reference group, it may work. But if I believe that my group suffers, it creates a kind of feeling of deprivation. It is group-based. That's why they are not so scientific from that perspective. This discussion brought us the concept of justice. We have two different dimensions of justice. The first one is distributed justice. We know that, which is defined as giving all members of society a fair share of the benefits and resources available. These resources may be income, wealth, opportunities, jobs, etc. It is outcome-oriented, and it is possible to measure this dimension by using Gini or power, other indicators of poverty. But in it, we know that there is a second dimension, which is intangible. It is based on processes, not the outcome. This is procedural justice. We are not only caring about the outcome of distribution in the society, we are also caring about how this distribution occurred. That's why it is procedural justice. The definition is somewhat complex, but it includes voice, access to power, neutrality or impartiality, how power is exercised, respect or standing, and trustworthiness. All these concepts, they are psychological and they are based on perceptions. It is not easy to measure them objectively, but by using this conception, first we are switching to the procedure, to processes, and we are also focusing on the psychological dimension. That's why emotions, they are becoming very important. Fairness is the key concept here. It's a basic human impulse. It is hardwired, so-called, and neurological studies show that if we are facing with unfairness, some very important networks in our brain are activating. There are some examples, for example, ultimatum gain. If you are interested, you can find it. We tend to punish unfairness. Even we can lose. It's a strong tendency for punishing the other who violates the moral norm. That's why anger is the feeling of emotion of unfairness. If we are facing with unfairness, anger comes. It's a group-based emotion. It is not only based on our own experiences. We can easily reflect experiences of our peers, our in-group members in the terms of social psychology. Then it can compete with guilt, shame, and other feelings, but anger is the strongest one. And I personally believe that anger is the key to understand the next elections. Anger triggers the body's fight or flight response, causing the adrenaline stuff. We are taking risk when we are becoming angry. We are underestimating the consequences, negative consequences of our actions. And we tend to scapegoat people. We are looking for the responsibility of this immoral behavior. Anger is a moral emotion. It is very close to definition of Nietzsche of resentment. This is not same, it's very close. And when we are feeling angry, we are becoming prejudiced. These are outcomes of being angered in the political. Before moving to the US elections, I want to present the findings of 3 different and very interesting studies about how anger affects our political. This is from the article of Wendy Perlman about emotions and micro foundations of the Arab siblings, Arab uprising, and it shows that people went out for fighting against the authoritarian regimes of the Middle East as they became angry. Anger pushed them to underestimate the risk of dying. Revolutions, they are very risky. You can die there. But if you are becoming angry, you are underestimating this risk. And coupled with the very famous concept of Timur Kuran, information cascades, we are underestimating the risk of dying, and we are overestimating this possibility of success of the revolution. That's why people went out. He showed she showed. Another piece written by my friend Cengiz Erişen, and in a survey experiment, he showed that when you are triggering anger, you are pushing for participation. Do you see? This is the first coefficient here. Yes, here. I can show, or I can show here. Here. This is the first coefficient. It shows that it pushes people to participate, passive or in an active way. And in another study, Erdem Aytaç and his friends showed that anger was the key element in the Gezi protest. He showed quantitatively, and I showed qualitatively, that in the narratives of the participants of the Gezi protest, the anger was the dominant theme. I was there because they did that one, they did that one. It was a violation of moral norms, fairness, and I was there. I didn't care about dying or other hazards. That's why all this quantitative and qualitative stuff show that anger plays an important role in the protest. And here you can see a scene during the protests of George Floyd protest. And I personally believe that anger will play an important role in the next elections. First, you can easily see that elections will happen in a very polarized environment. That's the approval rate of Donald Trump. You can see by party affiliation, it was 88%, and it is still 93%. It was the last figure I found. And not surprisingly, the approval rate of Donald Trump is less than 10% among the Democrats. It's a very polarized election. People will vote through their party identities. It's something else. And we also know that what happened during the last 3 months negatively affected the mood of the American people. This is Hidometer. It's a very nice tool. It draws a kind of sentiment analysis of the American public by analyzing tweets in English. Not surprisingly, you can see that after the drop at the beginning of COVID pandemic, it declined sharply and it started to increase with time. It's very similar to our picture in our experience. And after the murder of George Floyd, can you see the drop? It dropped sharply. The environment, emotional environment changed in the US. Of course, it becomes softer within time, but it creates an important decline. But similar to party positions, similar to presidential preferences, emotions, they are also polarized. It shows that it's another finding, and you can see that anger increased to 38% in the first week of June, and it declined, not surprisingly. But if we move to breakdowns, you can see that anger was observed more frequently among the Democrats, 43%. Can you see? And Republicans, of course, they experience that feeling, but relatively in a less frequently. And you can easily see that negative emotions were more frequently observed among the Democrats, not Republicans, meaning that feelings, emotions are also polarized in the US context. This is not surprising. And another finding I want to show is it shows that how feelings they are polarized. So you see anger It is highest among the Democrats, and it's lowest among the Republicans. This is a new finding conducted in June. That's why we are calling this situation as affective polarization. It is affective. It is different than ideological polarization. It's based on emotions or it is based on the affective dimension, not only behavioral. I personally believe that the main reason of this polarization or of this negative affect is the race relations. It's a relatively new research conducted by Mormon University. You can see that a percentage of those agree with the argument that race relations worsened during Trump, and there is a gap between Republicans and Democrats. 87% of Democrats say that race relations worsened during the Trump era. There is a relationship between ideological standing, age matters, and it may be interesting for us. There is a huge ethnic or race gap here between white, non-Hispanics, and the rest of the population. 68% of the rest of the population thinks that race relations, they have been worsened during the Trump. And there is a gap between Black Americans and other non-white Americans. It means that there is a feeling of unfairness in that picture. And perceptions about police brutality, you can easily find all these figures, but still there is a partisan gap. 24% of Republicans agree with this argument, and 83% of Democrats, they agree with this argument. And there is an ideological correlation here. Liberals, they agree with this argument. There is a race gap, and there is a gap between the races. 87% of Black Americans agree with this argument. Perceptions about police brutality. And not surprisingly, protests, justification of protests. Only 7% of Republicans think that protests can be accepted. And this, not surprising, this scores, they are not very high, but there is a huge gap between Democrats and Republicans, white Americans and non-white Americans, Black Americans and other Americans, other ethnic minorities. And when we are talking about anger, is anger justifiable? You can see the same stuff. A partisan gap, an ideological gap. Now it may be interesting for us youngsters. They find this anger justifiable. 71% is something interesting. Since we don't have access to raw data, it's not possible to conduct that kind of multivariate analysis, and we don't know what kind of spurious correlations there are, but yeah, it's meaningful. A small gap between white and non-white, and I didn't address this gap, but there is a gap between educated whites and non-educated whites. It's maybe an indicator of education. Now education matters. And what are conclusions? What are possible consequences? The first, voting turnout matters. When we look at the 2016 elections, the surprising victory of Donald Trump, the most important reason of this victory was the lower turnout rates among the Black Americans. It was lower. It was almost equal to 2004, which wasn't a colorful election, and it was significantly lower than the participation rates of 2012, which was the very boring election. Clinton failed to mobilize Black voters, but voting turnout matters. As you know, in the US, voting turnout, they are very low, but you need people at the ballot box. And you can easily see that Asian and Hispanics, they are always presenting a lower rate of participation. And the answer may lay here. Anger mobilizes people, as I tried to show in these previous studies. If you can put anger there, you can attract people to the welfare. That's the logic. That's why anger may be the key factor affecting the outcome. Democrats and Black Americans, they are angry because of the unfairness of the system. They know it. You can use it and you can mobilize people. Mobilization, that's the key. You need to mobilize them, and anger is the answer. But a recent study shows that anger is very easy to be manipulated. You can manipulate anger, and this figure shows that a significant portion of social media accounts was under the control of bots, and it opens the avenues for the manipulation of election results. This finding is about Black Lives Matter post, and you can see that 67% of pro-BLM accounts were fake. It opens that kind of avenue for quote-unquote foreign intervention and the presence of bots, as we observed in the case of 2016 elections in the US and in the Brexit situation and in the last election and in the UK. Bots were there, and bots can manipulate feelings and emotions by presenting specific stuff. And finally, by focusing on the anger, perhaps we forgot another important emotion, which is fear. My speculation was that all these COVID-19 pandemics created an environment of terror or horror, and it created a climate of fear, which was very similar to the case of the 9/11 attacks or terrorist attacks in Turkey, etc. When fear occupies the scene, we tend to stick to authoritarian leaders, simple solutions, simple rhetoric, and clearly to the populist politics. Our research about populist emotions and populist politics shows that anger is the emotion of populist politics, not the fear. But there are some other works there. There is a dynamic link between the fear and anger by the intervention of politicians who show the scapegoat of this negative situation. I personally believe that in the short term, anger will dominate the scene, but we need to care about the fear, which is also another important emotion. This is my presentation. For instance, I will be happy to answer.
Thank you, Emre. It was a very nice, concise, insightful, and very informative presentation with loads of data that need to be taken into consideration. So, before moving to Yunus, if you let me, I can just leave the questions to the last section of this webinar, because we already have two questions. Aylin Akyüz, she has a question, and Sebastian Legay, he also has a question. But if you allow me, I would prefer to move to Yunus' presentation, then to address these questions all together in the later part of the webinar. Yunus, the floor is yours. You have plenty of time. You don't have to hurry, but if you can just wrap all your presentation within 20 minutes, it would be fantastic. We can't hear Yunus' voice. Yunus, we cannot hear you. Okay, now I hear you. Now, okay.
Can you hear me?
Now I hear you.
Yeah, because I turned up my off, apparently. Sorry. Okay, so first I would like to commemorate all those who have lost their lives in Sivas 27 years ago. Today is the day. Okay, my presentation today. Today I'm not going to present a paper. However, I will try to make a tentative argument on the relationship of populism and pandemic management, based on some insights from the general literature on populism, and the U.S. case, my observations about the U.S. case, especially the U.S. case of populism in power, that is Trump's platform and the 2020 November elections. So I will claim that populism could not provide the hegemonic frame of politics during this crisis, as this crisis produced a particular kind of public discussion that could not be reduced easily to populist terms, or that could not be reduced successfully to populist terms. So, but as I say that, I would like to clarify also my claim. The first clarification I would like to make is that this does not mean the fact that populists could not successfully hegemonize the populist terms, could not successfully hegemonize the public political debate, does not mean that all populists in power were unsuccessful in constructing themselves as capable actors in confronting this crisis, that is, pandemic. However, their success was the successful populist cases in controlling the narrative were generally based on a nationalist frame and authoritarian instruments that were available to them. So secondly, even if my claim that the populist frame could not become hegemonic during the pandemic is correct, this does not mean that populists will lose their voting support in competitive systems in the upcoming elections. So as there are many other determinants of voting behavior other than crisis management. Okay, so in what follows, I will make first a few observations, definitions, determinations, and distinctions. And then I will mostly using US examples, I will illustrate my initial claim. So first of all, I would like to start with a brief discussion of democracy and populism. Democracy is composed of three dimensions: multi-party elections, oppositional liberties, and checks and balances. This is like a very standard definition. Therefore, modern democracies are basically regimes where political power is divided between different political elites that cooperate and compete with each other while making decisions while ruling the country. In these political regimes, the ruling groups are composed of politicians, judges, bureaucrats, and experts of different kind. They rule together, balancing each other out within a constitutional framework. So, populist politicians in general, or populists in general, populist citizens probably also in general, claim to change this balanced regime that we call democracy in favor of politicians that they claim are the true representatives of the authentic people of the country. Populists have a particular vision of society and politics, so those two dimensions that I would like to mention briefly of populism. Populist's vision of society is based on the claim that the fundamental division within the society, within their own society, is in between pure people and the corrupt elite. In other words, they claim that a section of the society constitutes the pure authentic people. Another section of the society are elites that are alienated from their own society, culture, etc. So that's their society vision. And the populists also have a particular vision of politics or democracy that is built on this societal that is built on their understanding of how society is divided. They argue that the true democracy is the reflection of the will of people, or of the section of the people that they consider the whole people in power. So this, as such, populism, if it comes to power within democracies, which is based on different groups balance each other out, different elite groups, representatives, politicians and bureaucrats and experts balancing each other out. So it has a potential to disrupt this modern democratic system and autocratize it, obviously, slide into authoritarianism, slide their countries into authoritarianism. Anyway, this is only tangentially related to our discussion today. So I will leave it there, and I will turn into. So I will make my second point now. I would like to mention that populism and pandemic can be studied through two questions. Studied through two questions that are entangled, obviously. First is the question of how did populists in power respond to this pandemic? This question comprises many sub-questions. For example, did they take the pandemic seriously? What type of policies did they devise to contain it? How did they make those decisions? How did they consult? Who did they consult, obviously? Who did they consult making these decisions? How did they frame the pandemic to the society? That last sub-question is something that I will discuss a little bit more further. So basically, how did populists respond to the pandemic? The second question is, what did the pandemic do to populists in power? This one can also have sub-questions, obviously. How did the pandemic influence the support of populists, which is closer to the title of today's meeting? How did the pandemic influence populist ideology, populist propaganda, populist political style? That part I am also interested in a little bit. So my third point is that not everything that populists in power do in response to the pandemic can be explained by populism. So by their populism. So populism has become a quite fashionable subject matter in social sciences and intellectual circles in the last few years. Especially after the electoral victories of populists or populist platforms in North America and Europe. The explosion of populism studies that ensued is most welcome in the sense that it led to many theoretical and empirical studies on the relationship of populism and democracy, populism and gender, all of those. However, especially with the current autocratization wave, I believe that the concept is being overused right now, and sometimes beyond its explanatory capacity. So I believe that there is a need to limit this discussion, when we are discussing the relationship of populism and the pandemic. So first of all, I would like to clarify the obvious fact that populism is probably not an important factor in determining the impact of COVID in a particular country run by populists. So the populism of populists do not explain probably populist rulers' all responses to the pandemic, and definitely not the outcomes. Even though populism may be influential in shaping their decisions, most of the outcomes are most of the COVID pandemic outcomes are related to non-ideological, non-leadership type of factors, like demographic factors, like state capacity, structural factors, state of the economy, state capacity, healthcare systems, conditions, stuff like that. So that one was obvious distinction. The second one is probably more important. Even if we believe that political leadership and their ideological tendencies are important in shaping their decision making, and which I agree, by the way, a statement that I agree that they are influential. Populism is not a full ideology, and it is not the only ideological tendency of populists in power in countries that they are in power. So thus, a populist leader can be at the same time a nationalist, a market fundamentalist, a right-winger, etc. So those other features of their ideological platform may determine the outcomes, not their populism. So not everything that populists in power do are because of their populism, but because of other elements within their ideological bundle. So in response to COVID, for example, a populist leader who believes in the sacredness of market mechanisms is going to behave differently than a populist who has no qualms about intervening into the market or against the private sector or disciplining the private sector more easily. So, for example, in the U.S., from the U.S. politics of pandemic management, the Republican majority in the Senate blocked bills that would secure paid sick leave at the beginning of the pandemic. This probably contributed to the initial spread of the virus. They did so. Why did they block this paid sick leave that would slow down the pandemic? They did not do it because they are populist. They did it because they are pro-capital, anti-welfare state party. So it's another part of their ideological platform that explains that, that probably explains that outcome much more readily than their populism. Okay, with my fourth point, I would like to elaborate on my initial hypothesis on the relationship of populism and the pandemic. COVID-19 is a virus, so I'm going to try to relate this based on literature and a little bit more abstractly, relate what type of politics the pandemic entailed, and how would we expect populists to react to this pandemic. So I believe that COVID-19 had a huge, I mean, I don't believe it's a fact, had a huge impact on all societies, but it also required coordination between individuals, groups, and individuals to contain it. So the three factors that were particularly relevant in discussing the relationship, three factors about the COVID pandemic were particularly relevant in discussing the relationship of populism and the pandemic. First of all, the fact that the pandemic could be spread by asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic people, and given difficulties in mass testing, especially at the beginning, required the institution of dramatic rules that everybody needs to follow for public good. That is health, right? Public health. Secondly, pandemic outcomes are relatively more concrete than most politically impactful decisions. So think about the 2010 referendum in Turkey. Some of us tried to defend that a judiciary under the control of executive branch would potentially lead to autocratization. But this did not end up convincing many because outcomes were evasive. Political outcomes are generally evasive and indirect. So what does autocratization mean? How can this be measured, etc.? So the outcomes are not readily apparent to general public. So for the pandemic, though, the situation is quite a bit different. There are concrete results of the decisions that politicians make. We have more or less easily available stats on the number of people who are COVID positive, hospitalization rates, death rates, etc. So it is a more concrete and more tangible. It has more concrete and more tangible results. That also complicates the story, I believe, for populist framing of the pandemic. The third one is health and economic outcomes are extremely important to most people, members of the society. So we can expect most people to pay attention to political decisions in these times. So it is still different than, for example, the most political issue, most important political issue like institutional design, constitutional design, etc. These are directly hitting people in their homes. So because of all these factors, I believe individuals were forced to think about the relationship of politics and society and the organization of the relationships between different individuals. So this meant an explosion of public political debates. It's I believe we live in one of those moments of very high politicization. People look at politics, how we arrive at collective decisions much more than usual times. So based on this, I would like to make, based on this discussion of what pandemic entails, I would like to make a couple of hypothetical statements about the relationship of populist vision of politics and the pandemic. First of all, I would expect the pandemic to generate challenges to populists. I would expect populists to lose some of their allure, as it may not be possible to direct the costs of policies to the section of the society that populist deems anti-people. Sorry, are you with me? Can you hear me? Good. All right. My computer froze for a second. I'm sorry. So the first one is I would say that the populist framing would not get a lot of mileage. That's the first one. So the second expectation that I would have is that populist rulers to have more difficulties than non-populist rulers in receiving and interpreting signals from experts and scientists and managing to transform them into policies because of their basic understanding of democracy and how politics should work. Finally, this is my slightly more empirically oriented discussion. I would like to make a few observations on the determinants of how right-wing populists in power how would they be affected? What were the determinants of their decisions? Sorry, what are the determinants of decisions of populists in power in this pandemic, and contextualize the claim that I made at the beginning. First of all, there was a diversity in their policies and in their relationship with experts. Populists in power, there was a diversity within the group, within populists in power, how they reacted to this pandemic. However, there were also some common elements, especially in in democracies that populists are in power. First, in countries like US and Brazil, populists were late in taking the pandemic seriously. They did not take measures quickly, and they did not provide, that's the most important part probably, they did not provide a consistent and clear message to the society on the seriousness of the public health concern. In the US, for example, Trump and many Republican rulers acted in ways that would encourage antisocial behavior, like not putting on masks, but I'm going to pursue this example. Besides, the government had a very problematic relationship with the public health experts, including the federal public health experts. So populist framing was common all around the pandemic, especially in the US case. For example, Alex Castellanos, a veteran Republican strategist, now I'm going to read this, said the following a few days ago. He said, "Mask wearing has become a totem, a secular religious symbol. Christians wear crosses, Muslims wear a hijab, and members of the Church of Secular Science bow to the gods of data by wearing a mask as their symbol, demonstrating that they are the elite, smarter, more rational, and morally superior to everyone else." So this populist and culture war type of framing of the pandemic has been pervasive in the US since the beginning of the pandemic. This was led by Trump, who refused to wear a mask, who derided people who wear a mask. For example, a couple of days ago, during an interview, a reporter was wearing a mask, and he said, he was irritated. He was visibly irritated by him wearing a mask. And he said, well, I know that you are wearing a mask because, I quote, because you want to be politically correct. So basically, what happened is that they had this ambivalent attitude, or even attitudes that, they behaved in a way to frame this public had precautions, measures in populist terms. However, it looks like they failed to construct this populist cultural division as a hegemonic narrative. Public discussions, way beyond liberal circles, have taken a more socially responsible, public good-oriented turn. For instance, a strong pro-mask, like from my example, but there are other examples that I could give. A strong positive pro-mask turn has occurred within American public. According to polls, for not only overwhelming majority of Americans wear masks in public, especially inside, but also even a significant number of Republicans agree that wearing masks should be mandatory. For example, 27% of Republicans say that both indoor and outdoor masks should be mandated by public should mandate wearing masks, and 25% saying that indoor only it should be publicly mandated. This is one poll, but you can check other polls. They mostly over 50% of Republicans are for wearing a mask, or they declare that they wear masks. But over 50% want public mandate for wearing masks. Also, American voters' approval of Trump's response to the coronavirus has been steadily declining since the beginning of April. And as of July 1, response approval, like coronavirus COVID response approval rate of President Trump was at 39.5%. And disapproval rate was at 56.3%, so close to minus 17 points. This is like, this may go further down, but I believe that may not, because this is also very close to his general approval rate. But that it's an important point. His approval rates, his approval rates on economic issues are much higher than this number, are actually net positive or around zero. So this is happening. His response to pandemic is probably thought as a separate issue than his response to COVID. So COVID economic aspects are not necessarily evaluated by the people in this in these polls. So also American voters' approval of Trump's presidency was decreasing. But anyway, I will discuss that later. Mm-hmm. So it looks like, overall, it looks like, at least in the US and to an extent in Brazil and Britain as well, COVID crisis could not be constructed as a populist moment. So some crises can be constructed as a populist moment, could be articulated in those populist terms. Some could not, and I think this was a failed attempt at constructing this as a populist moment. So I'm almost done. I'm around 20 minutes now, Burak.
Okay.
Can I go on a few more minutes? Good.
Okay. It would be great if you can now stop here, but you can later continue in the Q&A session.
Yeah, okay, so 1 minute, then I will make 1 point, and then I will...
Just the last point, okay.
Yeah, so basically, what I will say that the pandemic, what did the pandemic do to populist leaders? We can tentatively say that it weakened some of them to an extent, like Trump, Bolsonaro, and partially Johnson. These are leaders whose job approval rates went below pre-COVID levels, their own pre-COVID level job approvals. And also the gap, like for the American elections, the gap between Biden and Trump has widened considerably in the last couple of months. Now Biden is ahead, looks ahead in the polls around 10 points, not only due to COVID, but still it has something to do with it. On the other hand, some other Western leaders, non-populist leaders in democracies like Merkel and Macron, they lost some of their initial gains in polls and approval rates after COVID. hit their countries, but they are still above their pre-pandemic levels. So I will talk about, after the Q&A, maybe I can talk about a little bit how some populists in power, like in Turkey and Hungary, were successful in controlling the narrative, but they did so not through their populism, but through something else.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Yunus, for your conceptualization of pandemic and populist politics relationships. And I would like to thank you particularly for your commemoration of the Sivas massacre, which took place in 1993, which was one of the most terrible incidents in our history. So I also commemorate all those who have fallen in this terrible incident. Sebastian Legay asks two questions. He addresses one question to Yunus and another question to Emre. And Aylin Akgüz, she also has a question for Emre. I have also taken some notes, and I would like to ask some questions. But before that, I would prefer to let the floor to Aylin and Sebastian. So Emre and Yunus, it would be great if you can answer these questions within 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this.
Would you like me to read the questions?
Yeah.
It is written on the chat board.
Yeah.
Okay, I will. Okay, Aylin Akgüz's question is she addresses to Emre. Before Trump got elected in 2016, he had very controversial tweets about gun control in the US. Many analysts had argued that this would make the electorate upset and angry, so might result in him losing the elections. And he was elected in November. How could we be confident in this correlation between anger and electoral behavior?
Okay, yeah, we are not sure there is a correlation. Yeah, the key element here is that we are taking our decisions with the frames drawn by our emotions. In a negative emotional situation, your decisions will be different than your positive frame. And you know how anger and other negative emotions such as shame, guilt, etc., they are affecting our thinking frame. And of course, there is no direct relationship between anger and voting for Trump, etc. But we are almost sure that there is a relationship between anger and mobilization. And in our, I don't have the slides here, but in our previous analysis, we tried to show that Trump was very good at reflecting the major emotion of his constituency, which was anger. There are some quantitative and qualitative works, it is easy to find. He was good in reflecting. And we also know that in the last elections, mobilization of angry whites was significantly higher than the previous elections, especially in a specific set of states such as Pennsylvania, Ohio, etc., which were called as Dust Belt states, which were experiencing negative economic problems because of the economic crisis of 2008, etc., etc. Now, to summarize, there is no direct relationship between anger and voting behavior, preference for candidates, but anger plays a very important mediating role in our decisions. That's why it is possible to argue that anger will play a critical role. I hope I answered your question.
Okay. So another question for you, Emre, from Sebastian Legay. In 1968, there were elections, and just before the elections, there were also black protests and demonstrations in the US. These protests took long turn to a great advantage to Republicans. So if these protests will spill over into wider national unrest, would Trump have a better chance to get re-elected, even though Biden seems to rise his popularity meticulously?
Yes, yeah, it's possible because it's a dynamic relationship. It is not static. First, yeah, you have anger, then you are moving for protest, and you are starting with peaceful protest, then perhaps you are moving to more violent protest, or your media presents the situation as it is, and it creates a kind of backfire effect. Now, people are feeling themselves threatened because of this protest. That's why that kind of populist leaders can use the motto of order, law and order, such as Nixon, and they can try to convince their voters that that person can be only person who can save them against the public unrest, something like that. That's why there is a possibility that protest can trigger a negative, conservative reaction, especially in the rightist segments of society. There is such a possibility. But the key here is that we need to think about the mobilization, because all these surveys, polls we are referring, they are conducting people who say they will vote in the next election. And Nate Silver, famous statistics guy, says that these are not estimations. They are now elections. If an election would be held today or next Tuesday, etc., these are hypothetical. And in the last general elections, in the last presidential elections, we observed that even 1 week before, 75% of participants said that they would vote for any candidate, 75%. But participation was 55%. A significant 20% percentage point difference. Some of them lied. That's why it is not easy to make that kind of estimations based on the polling data. In Turkey, it's easier because our participation rate is very high, about 80%, 82%. Okay, we can live. But if 20% of, at minimum, 20% of your respondents lie, how can you make an estimate? That's the point. That's why mobilization matters. If you can mobilize your voters, go to the ballot box and wait until 5 o'clock p.m., etc., you can be successful. Participation rate will be very important, especially in this case, in that direction.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Sebastian has also a question to Yunus, but if you like, Yunus, I will tell this question. I will pose this question. But after that, let me also ask my own questions, and then you can further elaborate your remarks and your points after getting our questions, if you like. So just let me pose you that question from Sebastian. He says, based on your detailed account of populism and pandemic management, I am pessimistic to expect a panacea for democracies in the post-pandemic world. He says, so he asks your comment about his pessimism. I also would like to highlight a few points. Danny Roderick wrote a paper recently in which he started by asking a series of questions. One of these questions was about the rise of right-wing populism actually left-wing populists have redistributive economic agendas that must be expected to appeal to electorate much more. But actually it is the right-wing populists, ethno-nationalist and conservative agendas that become hegemonic. So this is an important question, I believe, because it has some implications. Emre, during his presentation, stressed the role of the deprivation over the grievances. So when we say deprivation or the distributive justice that he pointed to, it reminds us, it points to an economic justice and in economic inequalities. On the same token, Yunus said that the Republican senators who voted down the paid sick leave bill, they did this not because they were populist, but they did this because they were pro-capital and they were anti-welfare state. So the economic inequalities are apparent, and left-wing populists have much more concrete solutions to that. They defend redistributive policies, but it is right-wing populists, nativist and ethno-nationalist agenda that becomes hegemonic. So perhaps we should also focus on the role of cultures, values, and identities, maybe much more than the economic divides. And economic divides, it induces the sense of grievances and deprivation. Economic divides are about the lack of distributive justice. But in the end of the day, it is those who underline the cultural divides that are able to shape the politics in general. So I would like to get your comments about that, and in addition to Sebastian's question to Yunus.
All right, thank you. First, maybe I will say a couple of points about but the part that I didn't finish, and so that will help also Sebastian's question, my answer to Sebastian's question. So I talked about mainly populist, right-wing populists in power in US and to an extent Britain and maybe Brazil. These leaders try to employ here and there, especially I focused on Trump, try to employ a populist rhetoric to frame the pandemic, but they failed, at least that they could not construct it as the hegemonic narrative of the pandemic. So, hegemonic narrative about the pandemic. However, these leaders do not represent the whole range of responses that populist leaders in power carried out. That's why maybe that needs to be mentioned before answering your question. And in some populist countries, populists were quite successful in controlling the narrative and keeping their popularity up. However, like these contexts, in these contexts, it was not the populism of the leaders, populist leaders, but it was their authoritarian and it was their employment of authoritarian instruments that were available to them, and it was a nationalist rhetoric that they used to frame the problem, the crisis. So, but for this to happen, they generally, the leaders that use this type of framing and end up being more successful were generally right-wing populists. Like I have in mind Hungary and Turkey right now, more specifically. A country that is not a full or at least a defective democracy, so or a country that is unitary, where there are no challenges from subnational levels of government to the policies and pandemic responses. So that seemed to play their role, and structure of party competition. What was the winning margin of these parties? Were they safe in power in terms of voter support or not? So populists that are in federal democracies with relatively even party competition, like the US, I'm aware that my claims seems to suggest that the outcome is overdetermined, but in federal democracies with even party competition, using populist rhetoric strongly, they try to use the populist rhetoric more strongly than in countries like Hungary that are unitary, that had more authoritarian tools available to the leaders, because it is difficult to contain. It is difficult in democracies, and especially in federal democracies. It is hard to control data, hard to control criticisms, hard to control voices of experts. It's hard to make experts your ally. Experts within their diversity complicate your narrative. So Trump administration did not even try to reframe this as a national unity moment. But in electoral and competitive authoritarian regimes, or in unitary regimes with good winning margins, they were much more capable of turning this into a nationalist moment, but not populist. Not populist, but nationalist moment. They could form harmonious relations, yet hierarchical relations with experts. They could control the dissemination of data. If necessary, silence competitors, opposition, local authorities, etc. So this was successful. This could be made more successful, but not through populism. So, in response to your question, what does this say about the rise of right-wing populism as opposed to left-wing populism, in spite of, in this pandemic moment, that increases the economic grievances and economic inequalities, right? Also, the pandemic, let's not forget, the pandemic hits different classes differently. As it relates to the pandemic, I don't think right-wing populists did better. Right-wing nationalists did better. Okay, so that's my first answer. So the distinction that pandemic did not necessarily positively affect, I believe, right-wing populism or populism in general, but it positively affected, I think, right-wing nationalism, at least to an extent. But about left-wing populists are not in power right now in the Western world, right? And these economic inequalities, let's not forget, this is also this like a little bit Western-centric thinking that right-wing populists are more successful. Until last decade, until a few years ago, actually Latin America was under the rule of left-wing populists in Bolivia, Venezuela. It still is, but it's more problematic in Bolivia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Guatemala, right? So there are a number of countries that were like, so just because right-wing populists became more prominent in the West doesn't mean that right-wing populists were on the rise due to economic inequalities. This combination of economic inequality and competitive regimes produced left-wing populism in Latin America. All right, so that's in power. So that's partial answer. And my last answer to the future of democracy and the bleak picture that I conveyed apparently to Sebastian Le Guin. So populism might be, especially right-wing populism in power, the right-wing populists in power may be a little bit losing steam, at least during the pandemic. But obviously, due to the reasons that Burak mentioned, is emergence of populism or resurgence of populism is not based on transitory facts, right? It's based on according to emergence of populism literature, is based on structural factors, cultural divisions within the society, and in combination problems within democratic regimes, lack of participation, lack of outlets, all of those, and they have been around since late 19th century, and they will not go. They will not go out. They will be still present after the pandemic. Even if they lose elections now, it's right-wing populists. Maybe right-wing populism will recede a little bit, but right-wing populists in opposition will not necessarily recede, by the way. Check out Italy, for example, they are on the rise. But even if they recede right now, they will not disappear from our democratic. They will stay as an actor in most regions of the world somehow, and they may resurge again in the near future, as long as we keep democracy and as long as we have deep cultural divisions. So that's my answer. And democracy is a living entity, so is populism, and they coexist, and they will keep coexisting.
Emre, would you like to make any comment about the issues that has been recently addressed by Yunus? Or
yeah, there are some questions, and perhaps I can answer some of them. But before, Ebru cited with them data for understanding the relationship of the regime type and COVID-19 responses. Kerimcan Kavaklı just published a very nice paper about how populist governments, they are reacting to the pandemic. And I personally believe that it's a very technically very good paper. I personally believe that he gave some answers how populists in the government react to the pandemic. Not surprising that they are slower in early stages than they are becoming more reactive. But in that point, which is related to the question of Hakan Yapar about the victory of Green movement in the French elections, we have to think about how populists in the opposition reacted to the pandemic. My observation was that they didn't react as populist yet. In Germany, a student of mine wrote a thesis, a quick thesis, MA thesis about the AfD, and the situation of Le Pen is not clear. They didn't criticize the system, etc., because of the situation, but I personally believe that they will criticize. French elections, French local elections, and participation rate was 40%. It's very low. It was a reaction towards Macron, which was an artifact, a political machine instead of a political party, and not surprisingly, two more organized political parties became more successful, Greens and Socialists. It may be promising for us. Sometimes populists lose, but on the other hand, my observation is that the center right in France is dying.
Okay. Right.
Greens, Socialists, and etc. They are hijacking the political scene because opinions they are becoming more polarized. We will see in the near future. I hope I answered. A small point about
sorry for interrupting. For the participants who haven't seen Hakan Yapar's question, let me repeat it because Emre actually responded to that question. I was wondering your insights on the recent local elections in France, which poses a very different context and dynamics from that of the USA. How can we read the rise of Greens and losses of both Macron and Le Pen in terms of voter mobilization capacity? What type of emotions are stirred up? So this was the question that Emre has recently answered. There is also another question, and unfortunately we have some limited time. Ebru Şule Canan Sokullu. Şule's question is, what would you comment on the level of information about COVID-19 among the electorate? Some research still argue that there are significant portions of individuals who do not know much about this pandemic to form an opinion on the performance of governments related to pandemic governance. So here she implies the voter ignorance, I suppose. So this makes us even more concerned with the answer of the question, what should we expect? Yeah, the very famous and traditional question about the voter ignorance. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, information and misinformation. There are two important concepts here. And there is a new concept which is called infodemics, a spread of misinformation especially through social media, etc. I had a project on it. I have been awarded by National Science Foundation. I had to complete before the end of this year. We will try to understand patterns of information consumption of Turkish citizens and the spread of misinformation, etc. Misinformation is very important. There are at least six different false arguments about the spread of coronavirus, for example. And we know that there is a correlation in the belief of conspiracy theories and voting for these populist parties. It's a correlation. There is no causal link. I personally believe that. And that's why we need to learn how to inform people. It's very important. If people, all of the democratic theory is based on the knowledge citizens, not on ignorant citizens. That's why we need to learn how to inform people, especially in countries like Turkey or US, where echo chambers are very active. We are living in a chamber in which we don't have exposure to different information. We are getting similar kind of information. We are talking with similar people, etc., etc. We need to learn. And most people don't agree with Yunus. I don't take populism as something bad. It's a kind of feedback mechanism. Feedback mechanism of the electorate, of citizens towards a failing system, which is called parliamentarian democracy. That's the issue. That's why we need to think about it and how to make it more participatory, more responsive, and we need to care about all these procedural injustices, not only GMP or GNA, etc. We need to care how can we count the words of ordinary citizens. We need to think about it. Then we can improve the system. If not, my personal belief is that populists will win every time because they are hijacking the system. They are taking the system and they are transforming it to something else. Not something better, but something worse. I hope I answered and I gave the magic word.
The problem is at the beginning, you said that you disagree with me, but I couldn't hear the first 3 words, so it was like for me throughout the paragraph. Yeah.
No, he says that populism is not a bad. It's not necessarily a bad thing, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. Populism. I believe that populism. I don't think that it's a good or bad thing, but I believe that it has a potential to transform modern democracies into non-democracies, because it does not have its own vision of procedural, institutional ways to make that their claim of reflecting populists within power some kind of reality, semi-believable lie, let's say. So modern democracy does not reflect popular will in power. It does not claim to do so either. Populists claim that, but make modern democracy less reflective of popular preferences, grievances, and will, because they get rid of the popular will formation mechanisms. Anyway, so it is like so, but I don't think it's a bad thing. But I would say that they show us how modern democracy should account for more participation, more procedures of popular involvement into democracy. So there were these words these statements from different studies of populism that, it's a barometer of how modern democracy works. In a way, it's a critique of modern democracy. Like most critiques of modern democracy, it gives modern democrats a chance to improve their system and to see their problems. But it is not the critique, a good critique of modern democracy either. So I disagree with parts of the literature that argue that it's even a barometer. For example, they say that radical movements, populist movements improve democracy by making inclusion of demands that are overlooked by modern democracies, right? So inclusion of demands of sectors of the society that are overlooked can be mobilized through populism and can be forced to be included into the system. I think that that's not a feature of populism. That's the feature of any radical movement. Communists do that. Fascists do that too, right? There are certain grievances within the society, and they mobilize it. It's not a feature of populism that is democratic. It's a feature of every single radical movement living in a modern democratic regime. So I would say that populism is not even a good barometer. We would have better barometers than that. Anyway,
perhaps populism is not a good barometer because it's a manipulative barometer. Is it what you say? It distorts the reality.
Yeah, they all distort. All ideologies distort the reality and reorganize it in their own terms. However, populist critique of democracy is different than other radical critiques of democracy because it is targeting the essence of democracy. It says that populism is about the shape of democracy. How should a democracy look like? And other radical movements are based on different concerns, inclusion of economic, making the society more economically egalitarian, or, I don't know, white supremacy, stuff like that. Populism's critique is about democracy, but it's not a critique that would improve democracy if implemented. So it is a critique of a different order, I would say.
A last question before finishing, and I would be really grateful if you can answer in a couple of minutes. The generational issue, the political preferences of the so-called Z generation, which is a debate that has become very popular in Turkey in recent days. I would like to ask this based on the presentation made by Emre, when he was presenting the levels of justification towards some feelings amongst different groups. Emre showed that, he demonstrated that between those who are 18 and 34 years old, the anger, the feeling of anger is justified most. I mean, they justify anger more than any other age group. So the generation, the issue of generation and the politics is a very relevant issue, and perhaps in the upcoming years we will discuss about it much more. You guys, you both, do you have any comment to do that? Any comment about that? Sorry, any comment about that?
Yeah, first, I'm not sure that we can borrow all these American typologies and transfer to our context. I'm working on generations, I'm working on youth participation, etc. Of course, there are too many commonalities, and I observe that this is the period in which these commonalities are at their highest level. Youngsters living in Turkey, they are very similar to youngsters living in Poland, Spain, etc., especially compared to our generation and generation of our fathers and mothers. People, this is globalization, not surprisingly. But in each country has its own historical experience. And generations, as forwarded by Mannheim, is something historical. It's repeated history. Then these unique historical experiences will define the structure of the generation. But secondly, I'm against using this American typology, taxonomy, X, Y, Z. They are very specific to the US. And validity of these concepts is a matter of discussion. Secondly, I personally believe that all this COVID-19 thing, pandemic, will create its own generation. It will be very different than the previous generation because of many problems, economic problems, this closure issue, etc. So there are too many factors which will affect the structure values of this new generation. They will have something in common across the globe, but of course they will have something very unique to their own country. They say it's early to discuss about the victory of the new generation. Third, and lastly, I want to say that our political system doesn't include youngsters. It continuously and systematically excludes youngsters. Young persons, young individuals in the political life, they are not even acting as their peers. They are acting as small elderly people. They are imitating the establishment, or they are imitating their own leaders. They are not talking with their own voice. It's a problem. Similar to the arguments of Yunus, we need to find some ways to include them to politics, to the government, to the rule of the country. If with this picture, with our current systems, we are systematically excluding them. You're right.
Yeah.
But I don't rate any revolution in a one day.
Yunus?
I'm good, Burak.
Yeah, okay.
By the way, I don't have anything to contribute to this generation discussion. I think Emre's response.
I think so. Yeah. Okay.
Should be sufficient.
So thank you for joining us, for being with us. It was a pleasure to talk to you, guys, in this very important issue, and for all the comments and information you shared with us. And I would also like to thank Shule, the head of our department, for her efforts in organizing this webinar, and particularly our research assistants, Atakan and Çakan, who worked a lot for making this webinar possible. And I would like to thank all our participants who were with us, all those who asked questions, especially. So it was a very fruitful webinar, I believe, and I have learned many new things from both Emre and Yunus. Right, there are some messages coming from our participants. Nazlı Akgül says, thanks to you all for this great webinar. Hakan Yapar, well, huge thanks to all panelists and organizers. Ebru, thank you all. That was a very excellent, informative debate. Great to see you. Selcan, thank you all. Ebru again, happy birthday again, Yunus. Yes, right.
Yeah, happy birthday, Yunus.
Right, happy birthday. Rahime, it was great. Thank you for presentations and also for questions. I invite you all a post-webinar dinner on Bosphorus, says Ebru. Very tempting. It's a tempting invitation. Right. And the very nice words continue to come from Nazlı, Selcan, Ebru, and Rahime. Okay. So I believe it's time to end today's webinar. Hope to see you again in the following webinar, or that will be organized by our department.
Thank you.
Bye bye. Bye bye.
Bye.